Welcome back to Hopeful Horizon, where we share stories that captivate the heart and awaken the soul. Today, we bring you a tale of quiet strength, unwavering discipline, and the power of respect. It all begins in a small roadside cafe where a lone traveler, Jake, enjoys a peaceful meal until his solitude is interrupted by a loud and reckless biker gang. What follows is an unforgettable encounter where patience is tested, values are challenged, and one man's resolve proves stronger than intimidation. Stay with us as we explore a story of courage under pressure, the true meaning of integrity, and a confrontation that leads to unexpected lessons. If you love stories that inspire and surprise, make sure to comment below. Don't forget to subscribe and tap the bell so you never miss another powerful tale from Hopeful Horizon. And let us know where you're tuning in from. We'd love to hear from you. The hum of Jake's old pickup truck fell silent as he pulled into the gravel parking lot of a roadside cafe. The neon sign above the door flickered intermittently, reading Ethel's Diner. The warm yellow glow from the windows illuminated the surrounding lot, revealing only a couple of cars. It was the kind of place you'd pass 1,000 times on the highway without a second thought, but tonight, it was exactly what Jake needed. After months of deployment overseas, Jake Harris wanted nothing more than a quiet meal. He stepped out of the truck, his boots crunching against the gravel as he grabbed his well-worn military duffel bag from the passenger seat. Slinging it over his shoulder, he adjusted his cap, a faded army green with a patch that read 82nd Airborne Division. The moment Jake entered the cafe, the smell of fresh coffee and sizzling bacon greeted him. It was a small, cozy place with a long counter and a handful of red vinyl booths lining the walls. A waitress in her mid-50s, wearing a pink uniform with her name tag reading Bev, glanced up and offered a warm smile. "Evening, hun. Sit wherever you like," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. Jake chose a booth near the window, his back to the wall, a habit born from years of combat experience. From his seat, he could see the highway stretching endlessly into the night. The stars above were scattered like diamonds on black velvet, a stark contrast to the chaos he'd left behind overseas. Bev approached with a pot of coffee. "What can I get you tonight?" "Just a black coffee and a cheeseburger," Jake replied, his voice calm and measured. As she walked away to place his order, Jake allowed himself to relax for the first time in weeks. He set his duffel bag on the seat beside him, leaning back to take in the comforting simplicity of the diner. The soft hum of conversation from the few other patrons, the clink of dishes from the kitchen. It was all so normal. But peace never seemed to last long in Jake's life. The roar of motorcycles shattered the stillness, their engines revving aggressively as a group of bikers pulled into the lot. The sound grew louder and more obnoxious, drawing the attention of everyone in the cafe. A couple sitting at the counter exchanged nervous glances, and Bev visibly tensed as she watched the gang dismount their bikes and swagger toward the entrance. The door burst open, and 5 men strolled in, their leather jackets adorned with patches that read, "Iron Fangs." They laughed loudly, their heavy boots thudding against the floor as they took over a booth near the center of the diner. "Smells like a damn barn in here," one of them bellowed, his voice dripping with disdain. Bev, ever the professional, approached them with a forced smile. "What can I get y'all?" "Burgers and beers for the boys," said the leader, a tall man with a shaved head and a tattoo snaking up his neck. His name patch read Reaper. "We don't serve alcohol," Bev said nervously. Reaper smirked. "Well, ain't that a shame? Guess we'll just have to make do." The gang's arrival cast a shadow over the previously serene diner. Conversation ceased, and the other patrons focused intently on their plates, trying to make themselves invisible. Jake, however, continued eating his meal, seemingly unfazed by the commotion. It didn't take long for the gang to notice him. "Hey, soldier boy," one of them called out, pointing at Jake's duffel bag. "What's with the army crap? You think you're some kind of hero?" Jake didn't respond, taking another bite of his burger. "Oh, come on, don't ignore us," the biker persisted, standing up and swaggering over to Jake's booth. The others followed, their laughter echoing through the diner. Reaper leaned against Jake's table, his eyes scanning the duffel bag before locking onto Jake's calm, unreadable expression. "What's in the bag, huh? Medals for being Uncle Sam's little lapdog?" Jake slowly looked up, his piercing blue eyes meeting Reaper's. "Just my stuff," he said evenly. Another biker chimed in, his voice dripping with mockery. "Bet he's got pictures of himself saluting the flag thinking he's a badass." The gang erupted into laughter, but Jake remained silent. His stoic demeanor only seemed to agitate them further. Reaper grabbed Jake's coffee cup and tipped it over, letting the dark liquid spill across the table. "Oops," he said with a grin. "Clumsy me." The cafe fell into a tense silence. Bev stood frozen behind the counter, her hand hovering over the phone as she debated whether to call for help. The other patrons exchanged worried glances but stayed rooted to their seats. Jake took a deep breath, carefully moving his plate out of the spill zone. He reached for a napkin, his movements slow and deliberate. "What are you gonna do, soldier boy?" Reaper sneered. "You gonna cry or maybe run back to mommy?" Jake's jaw tightened, but he didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he met Reaper's gaze with an unnerving calmness. "Walk away," Jake said quietly, his voice firm but controlled. Reaper laughed, slamming his hands on the table. "Or what? You gonna give me a lesson in patriotism? Newsflash, hero, nobody gives a damn about your little war stories." The other bikers closed in, surrounding Jake's booth. One of them reached for his duffel bag, tugging it off the seat. "Let's see what he's got in here," the biker said, unzipping the bag. "Don't," Jake warned, his tone low and steady. The biker ignored him, pulling out a neatly folded uniform. "Ah, look at this. Our boy's got his dress-up clothes. How cute." The gang howled with laughter, but their amusement was short-lived. Jake stood up, his movement smooth and deliberate, and for the first time, the bikers noticed the tension in his frame, the coiled readiness of a man trained for combat. "I said walk away," Jake repeated, his voice like steel. The bikers fell silent for a moment, caught off guard by the sudden shift in the air. But Reaper wasn't one to back down. He squared up to Jake, his smirk returning. "Or what?" Reaper challenged, his voice dripping with arrogance. Jake didn't answer. Instead, he locked eyes with Reaper, his calm exterior betraying none of the storm brewing beneath. The tension in the diner was suffocating, every eye fixed on the unfolding confrontation. Reaper leaned closer, his face mere inches from Jake's. "You don't scare me, soldier boy." The sound of a chair scraping against the floor cut through the silence as one of the bikers stepped forward. Jake's gaze flicked toward the movement, his combat instincts kicking in. "You're gonna regret this," Reaper snarled. The cliffhanger hung in the air like a blade, the cafe holding its collective breath as the situation teetered on the edge of chaos. The silence in the cafe was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Jake stood like a statue, his calm gaze locked on Reaper's arrogant smirk. The other bikers encircled him, their leather jackets creaking as they shifted restlessly. Jake could feel the weight of their hostility pressing against him like a storm on the horizon. The patrons in the diner were frozen in their seats. The elderly couple at the counter exchanged worried glances, and Bev clutched a damp dish towel, her knuckles white as she hovered near the phone. Reaper jabbed a finger into Jake's chest, sneering. "You think you're better than us, don't you, soldier boy? Sitting here all high and mighty with your little duffel bag of war stories." Jake didn't flinch, his voice calm but edged with warning. "I told you to walk away." Reaper's smirk twisted into a snarl. "You're gonna make me. Go ahead, hero, show me what you got." The tension in the room snapped when one of the bikers, a wiry man with greasy hair, grabbed Jake's duffel bag and dumped its contents onto the table. Clothes spilled out, along with a few personal items, a worn photograph, a utility knife, and a small American flag folded neatly into a triangle. "Oh, look at this," the biker jeered, holding up the photograph. "Who's this? Your girlfriend? Wife? Bet she got tired of waiting for you to come home." Jake's hand twitched at his side, but he kept his composure. "Put that down." The biker ignored him, waving the photograph in the air. "What's the matter, soldier boy? She leave you for a real man?" The gang erupted into laughter, their voices grating like nails on a chalkboard. Reaper stepped closer, his chest brushing against Jake's. "You fight for a country that doesn't even care about you," Reaper spat, his voice dripping with disdain. "You're just another pawn in their game, and you're too stupid to see it." Jake's jaw clenched, his patience wearing thin. He reached for the photograph, but the wiry biker yanked it away, crumpling the edges as he shoved it into his pocket. "That's enough," Jake said, his voice low and dangerous. Reaper chuckled, leaning in until his face was inches from Jake's. "What are you going to do about it, hero?" The next few seconds unfolded in a blur. Reaper's hand shot out, grabbing Jake's shoulder and shoving him back into the booth. For a moment, it seemed like Jake would let it slide, but then his military instincts took over. In one fluid motion, Jake twisted out of Reaper's grip, grabbing the biker's wrist and flipping him onto the table. Dishes clattered to the floor as Reaper let out a startled grunt, his bravado evaporating in an instant. The diner erupted into chaos. The other bikers lunged at Jake, but he was already moving. A second biker swung a fist at him, but Jake ducked, his movements precise and efficient. He countered with a well-placed elbow to the biker's ribs, sending him sprawling onto the floor. "Stop it!" Bev's voice rang out, but it was lost in the commotion. Jake sidestepped another attack, using the momentum to grab a chair and block a wild swing from the wiry biker. The man stumbled, and Jake used the opportunity to sweep his legs out from under him, leaving him groaning on the ground. The bikers weren't used to being challenged, let alone overpowered. Their confidence shattered as Jake moved through them with the precision of a seasoned soldier. He didn't strike with excessive force, just enough to neutralize each threat. Reaper struggled to his feet, his face red with anger and humiliation. "You're dead, soldier boy," he roared, charging at Jake with a roar. Jake sidestepped the charge, grabbing Reaper's arm and twisting it behind his back. He pushed the gang leader forward, slamming him against the wall. "Enough," Jake said, his voice sharp and commanding. Reaper writhed against Jake's grip, but he couldn't break free. The other bikers hesitated, their eyes darting between their fallen leader and the man who had taken them apart with such ease. The silence that followed was deafening. Jake released Reaper, letting him stumble back toward his gang. "Get your stuff and go," Jake said, his voice cold and steady. For a moment, it seemed like Reaper would lunge at him again, but the look in Jake's eyes stopped him. There was no fear, no hesitation, just the quiet confidence of a man who had faced far worse. Reaper spat on the floor, glaring at Jake. "This ain't over," he growled. Jake didn't respond. He simply watched as the bikers scrambled to gather their things, their bravado replaced with humiliation. One by one, they shuffled out of the diner, their heavy boots thudding against the floor. The door slammed shut behind them, and the cafe fell into an uneasy silence. Bev was the first to break it. "Are you okay, hon?" she asked, her voice trembling. Jake nodded, bending down to pick up his belongings. He retrieved the crumpled photograph from the floor, smoothing it out carefully before tucking it back into his bag. The other patrons began to stir, murmurs of admiration and disbelief rippling through the room. An older man at the counter tipped his hat to Jake. "Damn fine work, son." Jake didn't respond, his focus on reorganizing his belongings. Bev approached cautiously, her hands wringing the dish towel. "I'm sorry you had to go through that," she said softly. "Your meal's on the house." Jake looked up, his expression softening. "Thanks, but I'll pay for it." Bev shook her head firmly. "Not a chance. You handled that mess better than anyone else would have." Jake sighed, pulling out a few bills and placing them on the table. "Keep the change." As he slung his duffel bag over his shoulder and made his way to the door, the patrons watched him with a mixture of awe and gratitude. Outside, the bikers were regrouping near their motorcycles, nursing their bruises and muttering amongst themselves. Jake ignored them, walking to his truck with measured steps. "Hey, soldier boy," Reaper called out, his voice laced with venom. Jake stopped but didn't turn around. "You're gonna regret this," Reaper snarled. "You hear me? You're dead." Jake glanced over his shoulder, his expression unreadable. "Walk away while you still can." The warning hung in the air, heavy with unspoken promise. Reaper hesitated, his bravado faltering under Jake's steady gaze. Without another word, Jake climbed into his truck and drove off, leaving the bikers to stew in their humiliation. The hum of his engine faded into the night, but the lesson he had delivered would linger far longer. The moon hung low in the night sky as Jake's truck rumbled down the quiet stretch of highway. The confrontation at the diner was behind him, or so he thought. A few miles out, he noticed the faint glimmer of headlights in his rearview mirror. They were too close and too erratic to be passing travelers. Jake sighed, gripping the wheel tighter. The bikers hadn't learned their lesson. He wasn't surprised. Men like that rarely did. Slowing slightly, Jake prepared himself for what was to come. The growl of motorcycle engines grew louder as the gang closed the distance, their headlights bouncing like predatory eyes in the darkness. Reaper, riding at the front, signaled to the others. Jake could see him in his side mirror, his face twisted in determination. The first hit came hard. One of the bikers pulled alongside Jake's truck and kicked at the side panel, the impact reverberating through the cabin. Another roared past him, cutting sharply in front, forcing Jake to hit the brakes. He pulled over onto the shoulder, his truck idling as the bikers circled like wolves around wounded prey. Jake took a steady breath, his heartbeat calm despite the chaos outside. Reaper dismounted, gesturing for the others to follow. He strode toward the truck, his swagger more pronounced as he grinned maliciously. The rest of the gang stood behind him, their faces shadowed, but their aggression clear. Jake stepped out of the truck, his boots crunching against the gravel. He closed the door with deliberate calm, his posture relaxed, but alert. "You've got guts, I'll give you that," Reaper said, his voice dripping with contempt. "But out here, no diners, no crowds, you're out of your element, soldier boy." Jake's eyes scanned the group, noting the positions of each biker. They weren't as organized as they thought they were. Their arrogance blinded them to their vulnerabilities. "I'm not looking for trouble," Jake said, his voice even. Reaper laughed, the sound echoing into the empty night. "You should have thought about that before you embarrassed us back there." Jake tilted his head slightly. "You embarrassed yourselves." The gang bristled at the comment, muttering curses under their breath. Reaper's grin vanished, replaced by a scowl. "Last chance to walk away," Jake warned, his tone carrying an unmistakable authority. Reaper sneered. "Or what? You'll lecture us to death?" He lunged forward, swinging a crowbar aimed at Jake's side. Jake sidestepped the blow effortlessly, grabbing Reaper's wrist and twisting it. The crowbar clattered to the ground, and Reaper let out a howl of pain. The gang sprang into action, rushing at Jake in a disorganized frenzy. Jake moved with precision, his training guiding every step and strike. A burly biker swung a chain, aiming for Jake's head. Jake ducked, using the momentum to deliver a swift jab to the man's midsection. The biker doubled over, gasping for air, and Jake followed with a calculated kick that sent him sprawling. Another biker charged with a knife, his movements wild and desperate. Jake caught his wrist mid-swing, twisting it until the knife fell to the ground. He disarmed him with a smooth motion, tossing the weapon aside before delivering a firm strike to the man's shoulder, sending him stumbling backward. The fight was chaos, but Jake was calm within it, his movements a blend of instinct and discipline. He avoided unnecessary violence, neutralizing each threat with efficiency rather than brute force. Reaper, now recovered, grabbed a length of pipe and swung it wildly. Jake blocked the attack with his forearm, countering with a strike to Reaper's ribs that left him wheezing. "You don't have to do this," Jake said, stepping back to give them an out. Reaper wiped blood from his lip, his face a mask of rage. "Shut up and fight." Jake sighed. He didn't want this. These men were reckless, but they didn't understand the kind of fight they'd picked. Another biker charged at Jake from behind, but Jake heard the footsteps on the gravel and turned just in time. He sidestepped, catching the man's arm and using his momentum to flip him onto the ground. "Stay down," Jake warned, his voice firm. The remaining bikers hesitated, exchanging uncertain glances. The tide of the fight had turned, and they were beginning to realize they were outmatched. Reaper, however, refused to back down. He rushed at Jake again, his movements more desperate than calculated. Jake dodged the attack, grabbing Reaper by the jacket and slamming him against the side of the truck. "Enough," Jake said, his tone commanding. Reaper struggled briefly before slumping in defeat. His gang stood frozen, unsure whether to intervene or retreat. Jake released Reaper, stepping back to let him regain his footing. "You've got two choices," Jake said, his voice steady. "You can keep this up and leave here worse off than you already are, or you can walk away now and think about what kind of men you want to be." The silence that followed was heavy. The bikers shifted uncomfortably, their bravado crumbling under Jake's unyielding gaze. Reaper glared at Jake, his chest heaving. "This isn't over," he spat, but his voice lacked conviction. Jake met his glare with quiet resolve. "It is if you're smart." Reaper motioned to the gang, and one by one, they climbed onto their bikes. The roar of engines filled the air as they sped off into the night, their retreat more an act of shame than strategy. Jake watched them disappear into the darkness before turning back to his truck. He rubbed his shoulder, the faint sting of exertion reminding him he wasn't as young as he used to be. Climbing into the driver's seat, Jake took a moment to collect himself. The night was still and quiet again, the only sound the gentle hum of his truck's engine. He glanced at the photograph on the dashboard, the corners still crumpled from the diner scuffle. Running a thumb over its surface, Jake allowed himself a small smile. With a deep breath, he put the truck into gear and drove off, leaving the events of the night behind him. The road stretched out before him, endless and unyielding, much like his own resolve. Far behind him, at the edge of the dark highway, the bikers regrouped, their anger simmering. Reaper's voice growled over the roar of their engines. "We're not done with him yet." The rising sun painted the horizon in hues of amber and gold as Jake pulled into the parking lot of a small service station. The long drive had given him time to reflect on the night's events, but the soreness in his shoulder reminded him it hadn't been a dream. The station was quiet, save for the occasional chirp of a bird and the hum of distant traffic. Jake stretched as he stepped out of his truck, rolling his shoulder to ease the stiffness. The solitude was welcome. Inside the station, the clerk, a wiry young man with thick glasses, greeted Jake with a polite nod. "Morning," he said, glancing briefly at Jake's bruised knuckles. "Morning," Jake replied, grabbing a bottle of water from the fridge. He added a pack of trail mix to his haul and placed them on the counter. The clerk rang him up, his curiosity evident. "Rough night?" Jake offered a faint smile. "You could say that." The transaction was quick, and Jake returned to his truck. He had just settled into the driver's seat when a low rumble in the distance caught his attention. His jaw tightened. The familiar sound of motorcycle engines grew louder, the echoes bouncing off the nearby buildings. Jake's gaze shifted to his rearview mirror. The bikers were back. They pulled into the lot, their faces set with grim determination. Reaper led the pack, his bruises barely concealed beneath his sunglasses. He dismounted his bike, followed by the others, and stood with his arms crossed. Jake sighed, stepping out of his truck with deliberate calm. The tension in the air was palpable, but he didn't flinch. "Didn't take the hint last night?" Jake asked, his voice steady. Reaper removed his sunglasses, revealing a fresh cut above his eye. "We're not here to fight, soldier boy," he said, his tone less mocking and more measured. "We want to talk." Jake raised an eyebrow, skeptical. "Talk?" Reaper nodded, motioning for his men to stay back. "Yeah, I'll admit, we underestimated you. You handled yourself different, not like anyone we've dealt with before." Jake crossed his arms, waiting for him to continue. "We've been on the road for years," Reaper said, "living by our own rules, taking what we want. It worked, until last night." Jake's eyes narrowed. "And now?" Reaper hesitated, glancing back at his men before meeting Jake's gaze. "Now we've got some thinking to do about who we are, what we've become." There was a sincerity in Reaper's voice that gave Jake pause. It wasn't a full redemption arc, but it was a crack in the armor of arrogance that had defined the gang. "You've got a choice," Jake said, his tone even. "Keep going down the same road and end up in a place you can't get out of, or turn things around while you still can." Reaper scoffed, but it lacked his usual bravado. "Easy for you to say. You've got discipline, training. We've got nothing." Jake took a step closer, his presence commanding. "Discipline isn't handed to you. It's earned. You don't need the army to teach you respect and integrity. You just have to decide to be better." The gang shifted uneasily, exchanging glances. The weight of Jake's words seemed to settle over them like a heavy fog. "You think we can just flip a switch and suddenly be good people?" Reaper asked, a hint of defiance still lingering. Jake's gaze didn't waver. "Number. But you can start by owning your mistakes. It's not easy, but it's worth it. For a long moment, the only sound was the faint rustle of the wind. Then Reaper extended a hand, not in aggression, but in a tentative gesture of truce. Jake studied him, the wariness in his eyes softening just slightly. He grasped Reaper's hand firmly, a silent agreement passing between them. "You're not off the hook," Jake said. "Respect isn't about making deals. It's about actions." Reaper nodded, stepping back. "We'll think about it." With that, the gang mounted their bikes, their engines roaring to life. One by one, they rode off, the dust kicking up behind them. Jake watched them disappear over the horizon, his expression unreadable. He didn't expect them to change overnight, but the seed of doubt in their old ways had been planted. Back on the highway, Jake allowed himself a moment of peace. The events of the past day weighed heavily on him, but he took solace in knowing he had done what he could. Stopping at a scenic overlook, he pulled out the photograph from his dashboard. The faces of his platoon stared back at him, their smiles frozen in time. "You'd be proud," he murmured, tracing the edges of the photo. The sun climbed higher, casting its warm light over the vast expanse of desert. For the first time in a long while, Jake felt a sense of closure. As he climbed back into his truck and resumed his journey, he left behind more than just a diner scuffle or a roadside confrontation. He left behind a reminder to those he encountered, a reminder that respect isn't given, it's earned. And sometimes all it takes is one person to show the way. Thank you for joining us for this gripping story of resilience, discipline, and unexpected redemption. Jake's journey reminds us that true strength lies not in aggression, but in restraint and honor. His quiet determination turned a moment of chaos into a lesson in respect that lingers far beyond the cafe walls. If this story moved you, be sure to leave a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Don't forget to subscribe and click the bell so you never miss another inspiring tale from Hopeful Horizon. We're grateful to have you as part of our community. Until next time, stay hopeful, stay grounded, and remember, sometimes the quietest voices leave the loudest impact.